You are now tuned into SFTV Africa.
Welcome to the conversation. If you spend even a few minutes on social media in South Africa today, you'll notice something interesting. Culture is everywhere. Traditional weddings, heritage day, celebrations, amapiano, cultural fashion, language clips, food rituals. It's all there, constantly moving across scenes, constantly being shared, constantly going viral. And at first, it feels like something worth celebrating, because for a long time, a lot of South African culture stayed within communities. It was experienced in homes, in ceremonies, in storytelling, in everyday life. But now it's visible to the world in seconds. A Zulu wedding can be reached by someone in London. A dance in Soweto can trend globally overnight. That kind of visibility never existed before. But somewhere in that excitement, there's another question forming. When culture becomes something we post, what does it become? There's a growing body of recent South African research that starts to touch this exact shift. One of the ideas coming out of the studies by Clark, Collins, and De Jong in 2024 is that authenticity online is no longer just something natural. It's something people build, something they perform, something they shape so it fits how audiences and algorithms respond. And that changes how we look at culture online. Because culture is no longer something you live. It is something you present. It's something you frame, something you edit so it fits a certain moment, a certain audience, a certain platform. So when you see a traditional clothing in a perfectly styled Instagram post, or a ceremony turned into a highlight reel, or a cultural dance turned into a viral trend, what are you seeing there? What are you seeing there? It is culture that is shaped visibility, or the culture being shaped by visibility. Not just a meaning anymore, but it means attention now. You post a cultural trend, it becomes more than just meaning now. It becomes attention. Another piece of recent research looking at South African influencer culture points outlines something similar. It shows that audiences still care deeply about authenticity. People can tell when something feels real versus when it feels staged. They respond more to influencers who feel connected to their communities, who don't just perform culture but actually live it and explain it in context. So there's still a demand for realness, for grounding, for cultural honesty. You understand? But here it gets complicated. Here is where it gets complicated. Because social media also rewards performance. The more engaging something is, the more it spreads, right? And in that space, culture can start to shift. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but slowly. A trend becomes shorter. A ceremony becomes content. A practice becomes a trend. There's lack of tradition there. And sometimes the meaning doesn't travel with it. At the same time, it wouldn't be fair to say social media is only taking from culture. In many ways, it is also preserving it. It's giving young people access to traditions they might not have grown up with, in a sense. It's helping people reconnect with languages. It's documenting practices that might otherwise fade over time. But you'll also find creators who are very intentional about this. People who don't just show culture, but explain it. People who add context. People who bring the story behind what you are seeing on screen. And the audience does respond to that. Because the research coming out of South African influencer studies in 2024 also shows that people value influencers who feel grounded in their communities. Not just polished, not just entertaining, but real, connected, familiar, something we can relate to. So authenticity still really matters, very deep in that. But it's being pulled into different direction because in the influencer space, identity finds itself becoming part of your content. How do you dress? Or rather, how you dress, what you celebrate, what language you speak, what traditions you show. All of it becomes part of how you are seen online. And when that happens, culture naturally starts to overlap with branding, with visibility, influence. But it is not always in a negative way, but in a way that changes how culture is expressed. And that brings us back to the same question, which is, when culture enters a space built for attention, what happens to its meaning? Because culture was never designed for algorithms, remember that. It wasn't designed for trends or engagement metrics. It was designed to be lived, passed down to incoming generations. It was meant to be felt, shared in context, and understood over time. So then the tension isn't really about whether social media is a good or bad thing for culture. It is about what gets lost and what gets preserved when culture moves into digital spaces. What gets explained and what gets reduced to aesthetics. What gets remembered and what gets turned into content. And who gets to decide the difference? Because right now South African culture is more visible than it has ever been. But visibility alone isn't the full story. The real challenge is making sure that culture travels through screens, platforms. It does not lose the depth, the meaning, and the lived experience that make it powerful in the first place. And we are figuring that out here at SFTB Africa. Thank you so much for listening. I am the man on the mic, Anonelo Quinton Siamahali. See you in the next one.